joining from other parts of the world is always challenging, isn't it? But let's give it a go. So, machine learning and human intelligence, the future of education in the 21st century. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about this today, and not least because I want to try and help people understand more about intelligence and how the advent of artificial intelligence is related to the need for us to reconceptualize our own human intelligence, because that's how we need to start thinking if we're really to transform the way that artificial intelligence impacts on our lives, at home, at work, and at play. So what is intelligence? If we look at the Oxford Living Dictionary, we find out that it's the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. But if we think a bit more deeply as academics, if we start looking at the academic literature and move on to the next slide, then we can see that if we look at the journal Intelligence, we find a slightly more nuanced definition of intelligence, but it's very much in the same sphere. So if we move to the next slide, we can see that the definition of intelligence from a recent journal, from recent conceptualization in the journal Intelligence, gives us a more fulsome description of intelligence as the general mental capability that, among others, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. And I'm sure that's something that we all recognize. And indeed, it's something that's influenced the way that artificial intelligence has been developed over the years. Next slide, please. So, oh gosh, we've had that one already. So if we move on to the next slide.
Yeah.
We look at where artificial intelligence was really born, and that is the 1956 Dartmouth College Conference, which was brought together 10 men to take part in a 2-month study that was about trying to understand how we could simulate intelligence. And it's interesting because at that time, 63 years ago, the belief was that we could simulate every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence. And we could simulate it or automate it because in principle we could describe it so precisely that we could build technology to automate, simulate, be intelligent. And the definition of intelligence at this point was the ability to use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve the kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. This is what we were aiming to achieve, which fits in nicely with those previous definitions of intelligence. So it's a complex human ability. Next slide, please. And it's very much an interdisciplinary human quality. So if we can click through the different links in this slide, we can see that intelligence involves psychology, and it involves philosophy, and it involves linguistics. And of course, if we want to automate it, it involves computer science, and it involves AI techniques. If we want to automate intelligence, we need to take account of all these different disciplines. And when I first started studying artificial intelligence, this is the kind of course that my degree and my PhD consisted of. Next slide, please. And of course, neuroscience. And in the early days of artificial intelligence, we had some interesting breakthroughs with what were described as expert systems. And in this example, we can see a medical diagnostic system. This consisted of a set of rules whereby the machine would try and diagnose an illness based on the symptoms that were presented to it. But the important thing about these systems were that they couldn't learn. So all of the knowledge, all of the information that the computer was using to make this diagnosis was based on the rules that were written as part of that computer program code. It could not improve. If we learned something new about a disease, the only way we could update this system was by altering the program code. Next slide, please. And so it was quite limited in what it could do. And then after many years, we had a kind of a public breakthrough in spring of 2016, when we had the instance where Google DeepMind had developed the program AlphaGo, and AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, the world champion at Go, playing Go, a very complex game. And you can see in that picture the image of Lee Sedol with his head in his hands at the moment that he realizes he's going to be beaten by this AI program. And this is very impressive, it's very sophisticated, and it can seem like magic. But in actual fact, it's very sophisticated algorithms that can learn. And so the key difference between those early expert systems, such as the one that I just showed you that's involved in medical diagnosis, and something like AlphaGo, is that the system learns. So if we take our example of that early medical diagnosis system, if it had been built using the same techniques as AlphaGo, then as new information about diseases came along, the system would be able to learn those. And as it interacted with more and more cases, it would learn from the cases that it analysed and diagnosed. So developing machine learning algorithms that can learn has been a breakthrough. Next slide, please. But this breakthrough is really powered by the perfect storm. And that perfect storm is the combination of the masses of data that we can now collect as people interact in the world, plus these very sophisticated machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms, and affordable computing power and memory. And these three factors have come together to create a situation that means we really do now have some very smart systems that learn and that can behave in ways that we would consider intelligent. Next slide, please. But still, at its heart, even machine learning is pattern matching. In the same way that those early medical diagnosis systems and other rule-based systems were based on the principle that you would match a symptom, the beginning of a rule, to the end of a rule, the result. So you would have a situation when you had, if the patient presents with swollen glands, then a rule might say you need to investigate whether they have mumps or not. So it was pattern matching a symptom to a potential rule. We now still have pattern matching, but in this instance, it's in the form of machine learning. It's the machine learning to map the instances of data that's input to it, so the game state in the game of Go, with its understanding of how that game is played, learnt over playing millions and millions and millions of instances of the game. But it's still pattern matching. So it's still intelligent in a very particular sort of a way. Next slide, please. And it's powered by data. Without data, machine learning can't perform. And this is why we often talk about data as being the new oil, because it's the power behind this modern machine learning AI. If you like, the machine learning algorithms feed on the data. Next slide, please. But in the same way that oil is crude and it must be refined in order to derive value from it, data is also dirty and it must be cleaned before it can be used by our artificially intelligent algorithm. So it's not straightforward. Next slide, please. And if we want to think about how machine learning can be considered intelligent, we need to bear in mind that it's not the same as human intelligence. Yes, our machine learning algorithms can behave intelligent in very specific sort of ways. It can play games, but a machine that can play games can't analyze a visual image, for example. And a machine that might be able to conduct medical diagnosis can't play games. So intelligent in very specific sorts of ways. And now, with machine learning, very dependent on the data that's been available for that machine learning algorithm to learn from. In the same way as humans, we learn from our experiences in the world, and our learning is limited by the experiences that we have. Our machine learning algorithms are limited by the data that they've been able to experience. So when we think about human intelligence, we have common sense, and we can understand ourselves. So if I ask you this morning what you've been doing, if I ask you what you know about artificial intelligence, how well you understand how an aircraft flies, or how you're feeling right now, you can answer me without any problem whatsoever. Even if you don't understand anything about AI or aircraft flight, you know that you don't understand anything about it. And if we ask how you're feeling right now, you can say that. That's hard for machine learning algorithms, and it's hard for artificial intelligence. And as I say, it's very hard to have any semblance of common sense, something we rely on a lot of the time. Next slide, please. So we need to bear in mind that artificial intelligence is intelligent. Our machine learning algorithms are intelligent, but in a very particular sort of way. Whereas as humans, we're intelligent in many different ways. So artificial and human intelligence are not the same thing, and the differences are really important. And the way that we have now developed these very intelligent and sophisticated machine learning algorithms means that we need to think carefully about our own human intelligence to make sure that we're valuing the most important aspects of that human intelligence. And I would suggest those are the ones that we can't automate. Next slide, please. So blending human and machine intelligence is what really matters for education and training. We want to get the best from our artificial intelligence, but we also want to get the best from our human intelligence, our human teachers. And we want to develop within our learners that human intelligence that we can't automate, so that then when they enter the world of work, they can blend and work alongside the AI. Next slide, please. This blending is fundamentally important, and that's really what I want to talk about. But why does it matter? Next slide, please. Well, we're now absolutely in the fourth industrial revolution. And this is used as a term to describe the fact that many changes have happened across the globe, one of which is the advent of artificial intelligence and automation in the workplace. That means that many of the jobs that have been traditionally the kind of job that humans would do are now increasingly being overtaken by AI and automation. And it's not just the simple jobs, the routine jobs. We're now seeing AI doing very sophisticated jobs in the finance sector, for example. So we really do need to rethink how we educate people. And we need to rethink how we can use this powerful AI as part of that education process, in the same way that we had to rethink our education systems during the third industrial revolution, the one that we usually refer to as the Industrial Revolution. Next slide, please. And there's been some stark warnings. I thought this was a very interesting statement from the Financial Times in 2017. The risk is that the education system will be churning out humans who are no more than second-rate computers. So if the focus of education continues to be on transferring the explicit knowledge across the generations, we will be in trouble, because that explicit knowledge is something that we can now automate. So we need to think differently. Next slide, please. And the wonderful thing about this thinking differently is that we can use AI to help us. Now, this image is the first instance that I could find of the use of the word robot. And it's in a play by the Czech playwright Karel Capek. And you can see these very grim-looking robot-like creatures who are, of course, human actors playing robots. Next slide, please. And what we want to make sure is that we don't go through this horrible transition where, having made robots that are created in the image of the human, we then turn ourselves into robots because we don't have the intelligence to realize that we need to focus our education systems on the aspects of intelligence that we cannot automate. Next slide, please. And it's interesting to look at the way that the fourth industrial revolution is covered in different parts of the world. This was some analysis that was done in Australia that I thought was very intriguing as a way of trying to encourage the population to feel positive about the fourth industrial revolution, automation and artificial intelligence. We're told that we're going to have 2 hours more a week because we will lose some of the tedious stuff of our jobs, and we will have 2 hours of time extra each week due to AI. We will have a safer workplace, our jobs will be more satisfying, and we'll earn more money. It's quite a nice vision. Next slide, please. But this is not a vision that's shared by everybody who's exploring the way in which the fourth industrial revolution is impacting on the workplace. There are many reports, an increasing number in the last 3 years, the number of different reports that try to predict and estimate the way in which automation and AI are going to impact on the workplace is ever growing. And this was one from last year from PwC entitled, Will Robots Really Steal Our Jobs? And we can see that sectors like transportation and storage are predicted to be the ones where most automation occurs. And we can see right at the bottom of the graph that education is where we perceive the least amount of automation happening. But I don't think that should fool us into believing that education is not likely to change. I think education will change in a quite significant way, but not because we will automate teachers, but because we will use our AI to alter the way that teaching is done. Next slide, please. It's also interesting to look at the analyses of the kinds of people who will be the most at risk of the jobs that are automated. And in all of the analysis, one of the viewpoints of agreement is that people with higher educational qualifications who have the best education will be the least vulnerable to the replacement and the changes in the workplace that come about because of automation and AI. Next slide, please. So education is important. But as I've said, there are lots of these reports, there are lots of analyses going on, and a question that I'm frequently asked is, Rose, is there a meta-analysis of all of these reports that will tell us the consensus of opinion about which jobs are going to go and how many jobs are going to go and what the changes are going to be? And the simple answer is no. There isn't that much consensus in the specifics of the numbers between the different reports. The consensus is that we're about to face massive changes. There is a consensus about that, and there is a consensus around the fact that it will be people with lower educational standards who will be the most vulnerable to the changes that take place in the workplace. But the truth of the matter is, at this point in time, trying to move forward sensibly is just like driving in very thick fog along a road that you've never been on before, so that you don't know how the road twists and turns, maybe goes back on itself and then goes forward again. And in this situation, next slide please, having a map is not terribly useful. What we really need is a car that we know we can rely on. We need to know that we have good lights, that we have good fog lights, that our steering is sound, that we can brake well. We need to know that the driver has good driving skills, that isn't feeling tired, that's feeling alert, that's aware of what's going on, that has good knowledge of how to drive effectively on the road, is good at anticipating what other cars might do. These are the things that are much more useful. And so in our current situation, rather than trying to predict precisely which jobs may or may not be here in 10, 20, 30 years, bearing in mind prediction is something that we've not got a good track record on, I think we would be better to focus on what it is we need as humans in order to be able to cope in this situation, this very foggy situation. Next slide, please. And if you can click through these, Lewis, I'll speak as you go. So the kinds of things we need is, yes, we need interdisciplinary understanding of the world. We also need to understand what knowledge is. This is a lovely little cartoon of the tree of knowledge discovering where paper comes from. We need to understand what knowledge is, how we should derive evidence that enables us to think, yeah, I do believe that's true. We need to develop sophisticated epistemologies, sophisticated understanding of knowledge in our learners. We need social intelligence. We need people who can behave well together, who can solve problems collaboratively. We need understanding of ourselves, what I would call metacognition. We need to know, what we don't know. We need to know how we can control our processes so that we can focus, we can pay attention, to know when we're losing attention and how we might get that attention back. We need what I would call metasubjective intelligence, understanding of ourselves, our emotional selves, and the emotional selves that the other people we interact with are. We need meta-contextual intelligence, an understanding of the contexts within which we learn, we live, and we operate. And by that I mean the environments that we work in, the people we work with, the tools that we work with. Again, something very, very difficult for artificial intelligence to do. And if we get all these different elements of intelligence together, then I think we get to the point that we have the most important of all, perceived self-efficacy, accurate perceived self-efficacy, which means that we can recognize a goal, we can look at that goal and we can understand how likely we are to be able to achieve it. We can understand how motivated we are in believing that we can achieve it and that we want to achieve it. And we know what it is we have to do in order to achieve that goal. Because one thing that's for sure is we're going to need to be much more self-effective in the world, because we're going to need to be able to learn quickly and change. We therefore need to instill those capabilities in our students, in our trainees. Next slide, please. And so these elements of intelligence shouldn't be seen as separate intelligence. It's an interwoven whole. And this is the kind of intelligence that I think we now need to think about in our education systems and in the way that we design our artificial intelligence systems to support our education systems, because it starts to throw light on the sorts of things that our artificially intelligent systems just cannot do. So we need to think in terms of these elements, and we need to recognize that 5 of them are concerned with what I would call meta-intelligence, intelligence that's about understanding ourselves and understanding others in the world. So let's just run through those different intelligence quickly again. Next slide, please. So we start off with academic intelligence, which is multi and interdisciplinary knowledge, our understanding about the world. But we need to recognize this needs to be more interdisciplinary as we move forward, because complex problems that need to be solved need expertise from multiple disciplines. This is the kind of intelligence that we can do a lot in terms of automation to bring about. Social intelligence, much more complicated for our AI systems to simulate, though they can help us to develop social intelligence. And of course, we need to understand our social intelligence. So there's a meta aspect to that. And when I say meta, I mean it's about understanding ourselves, not just understanding social interaction and the social intelligence of others. Next slide, please. And then we move on to meta-knowing, this business of being able to understand what knowledge is and where it comes from. Metacognitive intelligence, being able to interpret our own ongoing mental activity in a way that means that we can understand what it is we're doing in the world, and we can learn about ourselves in an evidence-based way. Next slide, please. And then we think about ourselves as emotional beings interacting in the world, and the other people whom we interact with as being emotional beings. The emotional intelligence that we need to have about ourselves and about other people. Again, hard for AI to achieve, although it can simulate emotional intelligence and it can help us to understand emotional intelligence. Meta-contextual understanding, recognizing our physical embodiment in the world, the fact that we do interact in different locations and spaces with different resources. And that's something we take for granted, but it's incredibly difficult to automate. Wherever we are in the world, we have a good chance of working out how we should interact. We're good at being thrown into new situations and knowing what to do. Next slide, please. And if we get these intelligences interwoven together, then we do get to this accurate perceived self-efficacy, which requires us to make evidence-based judgments about ourselves. If we say we know something, we need to know the evidence that we can point to demonstrate why we believe we know something. We need to understand why we're feeling in a particular way, why we're motivated, why we're not motivated. We need to understand our own desire to succeed and our own ability to succeed in specific situations so that we can accomplish tasks both off our own bat, but in collaboration with other people. And I think this is the most important element of human intelligence. And it is highly connected to the other 6 elements, as are all of the elements. Next slide, please. So it's important not to see these as separate, but to see them as interwoven. So no element has fixed dimensions. We're not going to know that we'll grow our emotional intelligence in this particular sort of a way at this particular rate, and it'll be grown in advance of our social intelligence or the other way around. We develop them at different rates, and different people develop those intelligences differently. And we know some things about how they develop in the general, but we're very individual. And we need to bear in mind the relationships between these different intelligences. And these relationships are complex and varied. So we need sophistication across all 7 elements. But some people may be more sophisticated in one area of their intelligence than others. And some elements will develop at a different rate to others. So the precise composition of this complex interwoven intelligence is very individual, in the same way that our fingerprint is. And if in our education systems we can help people to understand that they can continue to develop this intelligence throughout their lives, it's not fixed at birth, it is something we can develop and grow, and that we need to focus on the interwoven whole, not on one specific part of intelligence. And I would argue that we focus very much on that first element that I described, the academic intelligence, in our education systems at the moment. And that now that's the element that is easiest for us to automate. We need to think about all those other elements as part of our education system. Next slide, please. And AI can help. The wonderful situation that we're in is that not only is AI driving automation and causing the need for us to think differently about education, it's also a tool that we can use to help us deliver education in a new sort of a way. So we can think about artificially intelligent tutoring systems that can certainly help with some of the core things we need people to understand: numeracy, literacy, especially data literacy, and basic subject knowledge. And then we use our wonderful human intelligence to refine that understanding through activities such as debate and collaborative problem solving. We use our human intelligence to help develop our learners' social and meta-intelligences, including their metacognitive, meta-subjective, emotional intelligence, if you like, meta-contextual, and that accurate perceived self-efficacy. And then to help us in doing that, we can use our AI to analyze learners, the process of learning, through all the data that we can collect as learners interact in the world. So as teachers, we can understand much more clearly and in a much more nuanced and detailed way the learning processes that are what our learners are going through. And we can help them to understand this too, based on this data analyzed by smart AI algorithms. Next slide, please. So I said previously, data is like oil, and just like oil, it's crude, and it needs to be refined if we're going to derive value from it. Yes, we can collect masses of data about learners as they interact in the world, but if we want to use that data to understand more about their learning processes, we have to clean it because it's dirty, it's complex. We need to clean it so that it can be processed by our AI algorithms. And we need to make sure that we design our AI algorithms in a way that's informed by what we know from the learning sciences about humans learn. So it's very important that the AI algorithms that are used to process this data to inform us as teachers and learners are designed in a way that's informed by what we know about learning in humans. Next slide, please. And think about the masses of data that we can collect as people interact in the world. It's no longer limited to the kind of data that we collect as students interact with their laptops or their terminals. We can collect data through cameras that observe people as they interact in the world. We can collect data about the biology of our body through wearable technologies such as the ring in that picture. We can collect data as people interact with technologies in new ways, such as through speech-activated interfaces or voice-activated interfaces, such as Siri. And then we have the man on the bicycle wearing a jacket that's augmented with that technology that allows him to communicate as he's cycling, but also collects data about him as he's cycling, where he is, what state his body is in, what he's doing. Next slide, please. So we have this amazing ability to collect hugely rich sources of data. And this is one example of that possibility for data being collected in an educational situation. We have 3 students working together, collaboratively solving a problem. The problem is to build an interactive toy using some Arduino technology. And you can see the girl has her hands on the interactive toy and they're all looking at the toy, working together. And we're collecting information about their hand movements. We're collecting information about their eye movements. We're collecting information from them as they can input information to us about the stage of problem solving they believe they're in through the little personal technology device sitting on the table. And there are also 2 buttons in the middle of the table we call sentiment buttons that they can press, one when they're feeling things are going really well and one where they're feeling things are not going so well. So we can collect what I would call multimodal data. And we can also collect data from the computer technology that they're using, the Arduino technology, about the way that they're building that interactive toy. Next slide, please. And then we can combine all this data and we get representations like this. Now, this is a classic example of the sort of data the sort of visualization we can get from the data as it comes in. And it's not really terribly helpful. It gives us some information at the top about the students reporting on that little tiny handheld device about where they feel they are in the process of collaborative problem solving. We can have information about their faces, where they're looking, where they're not looking. We have the information from when they press the sentiment button. And we have information about what they've used through the technology. But actually, it's not terribly informative in and of itself, because we need to inform the analysis of that data by what we understand about human learning. Next slide, please. So if we want to build algorithms to analyze that data in a useful way, we first need to think about how we need to inform those algorithms and the design of those algorithms from what we understand about human collaborative problem solving. So if we look at the literature on collaborative problem solving, one way in which we can analyze that literature is by defining 3 particular competencies that are relevant to collaboration and 6 competencies that are relevant to problem solving, and they're listed on the slide in front of you now. And in our experience, what we did with this information in order to see how you would inform the design of an algorithm to analyze that data collected in that multimodal collaborative problem solving data collection scenario. Next slide, please. We built a small tool that we used. So this was us understanding how we could design the algorithm by analyzing the data ourselves. So as those students took part in that collaborative problem solving study, we as humans identified when we felt that each of the student groups was in a particular phase of collaborative problem solving using this framework. Were they identifying facts or were they planning and executing? Were they doing that in a form that was establishing and maintaining shared understanding, or were they concerned with team organization? So we had 2 observers, one collecting the collaborative problem solving dimension data, one collecting the collaborative data, the 3 criteria across the top, and one collecting data about the problem solving criteria down the vertical axis on this. Next slide, please. And we use this data to very carefully use this information to very carefully analyze all of that data that we had collected. We also went back to look at the literature to see what we already know about the ways in which data can be interpreted with respect to collaborative problem solving. So, for example, we know that synchrony is something that can be associated with student learning. So, if all our students are synchronized in where they're looking, where their hands are positioned, what they're doing, then that would be one indicator, just one indicator or signifier that learning might be taking place. So this is getting down to the nitty-gritty of what it is we want to do with all that raw data that comes in. Next slide, please. And therefore, we looked at our data through this lens, and we looked particularly at synchrony. So we took our collaborative problem-solving data, we looked at the groups that we felt, according to our analysis, using that framework of the 6 problem-solving criteria and the 3 collaborative criteria or capabilities that we were looking for, to analyse how well we thought our student groups were performing in terms of collaborative problem solving. We also asked a totally independent expert to analyse the videos of the students to decide which groups they felt were the most effective at collaborative problem solving. So we had 2 ways of evaluating the quality of the collaborative problem solving: our own framework analysis using those 9 capability criteria, and our independent expert looking at the videos. And then we looked at the data that we had collected using all of those different data tools, from the eye tracking to the hand tracking, etc. And in this particular instance, we were looking at whether the group, the individual members of the groups of students, the 3 members of that group, were synchronized in what they were doing. Were they looking in the same direction? Were their hands on the same artifact? These were the kinds of things that we were looking at. And indeed, if you look at the dark colored lines on this chart, what we found was that the groups of students who had been evaluated by our analysis and by our independent expert as being those who were the most effective at collaborative problem solving were also the groups with the highest level of synchronization between the activities of the individual members of that group with respect to where they were looking and what they were doing with their hands. Next slide, please. So this is just one example of how you can break down the data that you can collect and then rebuild the analysis of that data through understanding what we've learned from the learning sciences about how people learn. In this instance, about collaborative problem solving. And it would be now our task to use that to build the algorithms that would automatically analyze that data that comes in as people go through collaborative problem solving processes, so that we can automate the analysis using things like synchronicity as a signifier, just one signifier that would be combined with many to help teachers understand whether a group was effective in its collaborative problem solving or whether perhaps they needed some help at any moment in time. Something very important for teachers who are working with multiple groups of students at the same time. If we can get the AI to help them to get information about the groups that they're not looking at any moment in time so that they know when to pitch in and help, that can be enormously valuable. And this feeds into a long tradition within the artificial intelligence and education community of what's called learner modeling. And in particular, trying to open up the black box of learning by showing teachers and learners what any kind of technology that's tracking learning is accumulating in terms of that technology's understanding, if you like, of the learner. So this is an example of an open learner model that tries to tell learners a little bit about how they're progressing as they're learning in a system. Next slide, please. And the next example is one from a very long time ago that was a piece of software that we developed many years ago to help children in primary school, so that's children aged between 5 and 11 years, understand about food chains and food webs. And it tracked the students as they interacted in a micro world. And in particular, it helped the student by opening up the learner model, which is the bottom image there, in particular respect to showing the students when they were needing a lot of help with a particular task and when they had chosen a task that was particularly difficult. And we gave them some support to try and understand how they could better select a task that was just a bit too difficult for them, but not much too difficult for them, and how they could be more judicious in their selection of the help that they needed in order to achieve that task successfully. So we were trying to build their self-understanding of their metacognitive processes with respect to selecting difficulty level and asking for help. Next slide, please. So we know we can model quite complex student learning processes, but what we do need to decide is what is student success. If we're going to do this modeling, if we're going to do this tracking, how are we going to define student success? Is it going to be purely through attainment, or are we going to take those emotions into account? So we need to reconceptualize how we think about success in our students and work out then how we can use AI to help us analyze all the data that we can collect that can tell us in a much more nuanced and subtle way what it is that student success looks like for any particular student at any particular moment in time. Next slide, please. And if we get this right, we can think in terms of having what I would call an intelligence infrastructure, an infrastructure that underpins our teaching and learning interactions with students, that's constantly analysing data, informed by what we understand about how humans learn, that can help tell us about that student's interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary understanding, help tell us about how they're developing that sophisticated epistemology that means that they do understand what knowledge is, how they are socially intelligent, emotionally intelligent, how they understand their own cognitive processes, and how they understand their own contextual intelligence. Next slide, please. But what does this mean for teaching? Well, as I said, we can use our AI to help us with some of the basic subject areas. We can help with numeracy and literacy. We can start to think about what it is about a subject, a domain knowledge subject such as geography or history or physics, what it is that students really need to know, and help them to understand how that subject area has been formulated in the past. Why do we learn this in physics or math? Where does this knowledge come from, as well as what that knowledge is? We need much more debate and collaborative problem solving as part of our education system. And we need to ensure that teachers and trainers have time to work with their students to help them understand all of the data that is this intelligence infrastructure is producing. And we need to make sure that all of our students develop the complex, rich human intelligence that can help them take part in the complex problem solving that they're going to need to do in the workplace. Next slide, please. And if you want to know more about what I've been talking about today, I have a book called Machine Learning and Human Intelligence, which looks at in a much greater detail at what I've been talking about today. It's very hard to do the level of detail one might like to in a short talk. And this is also another publication that's free to download that I think is very interesting, called Learning to Learn, the Future-Proof Skill, that's very relevant to what I've been talking about. And that's freely downloadable from the website for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Artificial Intelligence in the UK. Next slide, please. So thank you for joining me today. I'm sorry about the slight hiccup at the beginning of the session, but I do hope that you've enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Thank you, Rose. So if you have time, everyone will stay on. If you have questions, type them in the chat window and we'll be happy to go over them. So one question that I have to start with, Rose, is that what you've laid out reminds me of what's sometimes been referred to as 21st century skills, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and communication. And I'm wondering, could you compare and contrast?
Yes, it's interesting. There's so many different versions of 21st century skills out there. And I think it's very valuable work. But I've tried to look at the core intelligence that underpins all of those skills rather than the skills themselves. Because I think for some of those skills, if you take, something like communication, that involves quite a lot of those different elements of intelligence. Yes, it involves social intelligence, but it also involves that emotional intelligence. And it may well also involve contextual intelligence, and it could involve the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary intelligence, because that might be what you're trying to communicate. So I tried to move away from the approach of looking at skills, valuable as it is, to try and look at what underpins those skills, so that we can look at the more fundamental aspects of what we need to change. It's also an important part of my reasoning for that was to try and get over what I see quite a lot in educational circles, where people have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction against the word skills. There's quite a bit of debate about, is it skills or is it knowledge? And I think that's a bit of a waste of time, because in truth, you need skills to develop knowledge, and you need knowledge to be skillful. So I was also trying to get away from that polarization so that we could move forward perhaps more constructively in thinking about how we need to redesign education systems, because we do now face this really quite urgent need to rethink the way that our education systems are framed.
So following on that, you talked about the data AI revolution that started in 2016, which is not that long ago, and educational systems take time to change, and so I'm wondering, do we have enough time for our educational system to change rapidly enough to keep up with the changes that AI is creating?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think what's interesting about that 2016 moment is there'd been years and years of work before that kind of accumulated in that moment when people recognized a transformation was happening. And I think perhaps we're in that phase in education now where there is quite a lot of work going on across the globe in rethinking education systems. But I think there's also a reticence, because it's hard to make really big changes. And so I think there will be a kind of a moment when we'll get to a point where there's no choice but changing. And I'm hoping that if those of us who are working in this area can sort of behind the scenes, in the background, be developing the kinds of tools that can support this new way of learning, when that moment of realization happens, there'll be a safety net of things ready to pick up and run. Because let's face it, most education systems are driven by politicians. And it's very hard for any politician who, in a democratic country, to make a decision about making some radical change in the education system when they've got to be re-elected in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. And they look at this and think, wow, that's way too big. I can't do that. And they tend to sort of tinker around the edges. But I think there is increasing recognition that actually we do have to make quite significant changes. It's just trying to provide people with the tools to help them make those changes, I think, Lewis.
You've visited educational systems around the world. You're in Hong Kong today. I assume you'll be visiting folks there. I'm wondering, are there particular systems that you think have been particularly successful in embracing the ideas that you've been talking about here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the country that normally we identify first is Finland, and certainly Finland is, an exemplar of interesting and good practice, looking more creatively at the education system. But there are other nations where really interesting things are happening too. If I look at New South Wales in Australia, they have a project that's all about trying to rethink education systems in a changing world, and recognizing that artificial intelligence is making a huge difference. I understand Estonia, and I'm trying to find out more about what's happening in Estonia, because if you listen to people like Andreas Schleicher, who's the head of the education analysis for OECD, he is very impressed by what's happening in Estonia. If you look at Shanghai in China, there's a lot of work being done on mastery of subjects rather than learning subjects in the traditional way. And that's something that will help as we move forward in this fourth industrial revolution. All over the world, people are trying to redesign their education system. In Egypt, they've done a lot of work redesigning their education system. In Palestine, I was listening to the Minister for Education in Palestine discussing the way in which he really wants to move away from the emphasis on high-stakes tests and certification to helping students to really master and understand a subject. And he was discussing how difficult it is, because quite understandably, parents want their children to have whatever the currently recognized currency of the education system is, because they want them to be able to progress to university or into a job. And if the currency in an education system is a certificate or a qualification, then of course parents want their children to have that, because they don't want them to not be able to move on in the system. So in a way, those are the things that have to change in order to free up the other changes. And that's where I think AI can be incredibly helpful. Because if we can build this kind of intelligence infrastructure through our AI systems that does the continuous formative assessment as students learn, then we get to a stage where we don't actually need those exams and high stakes tests anymore, because we understand and can evidence student learning without needing that test. So it's a good example of how I think working on developing these systems will enable those difficult decisions to be made by policymakers, because they'll see that there is an alternative already in place.
So up to now, we've tended to think of education as something which is directed at children, but
Yes.
Worldwide, people are living longer and they're more adult learners. Ones who perhaps went through the educational system in an earlier era and now need to adapt to the AI-enabled economy. What would you say to the adult learner who needs to thrive in the new economy?
Again, really important question. There are more people not in education in the workforce than those in the education system. So we absolutely need to help them, because it's going to be their workplace that changes, and sometimes quite quickly. I think the most important thing is mindset. I think, and part of the reason for that Learning to Learn publication from the All-Party Parliamentary Group here in the UK on artificial intelligence is that people need to get themselves into an acceptance state where they realize that learning is something we do throughout our lives. It's not something we do at school or a university, and maybe we have the odd training course at work. It's something we'll need to do all the time. So people need to get themselves into a mindset where they accept that the job they're doing now may well not be the same in a year's time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time. And that means they will need to adapt, and they will need to learn new things and learn to work in new ways. And I think there's a real role for employers there in helping their employees to feel okay about the fact that change is coming, and to feel that they will be supported to make that change. Because some of those changes might be quite dramatic. And so it's not just the employee on their own getting into a state where they go, okay, I know I'm going to have to be willing to change. I'm going to have to be willing to look at things differently, take on a slightly different role in the company, or whatever it is. Employers have a responsibility to support their employees as they go through that change, so that they can embrace and learn and go on developing. And if we get it right, it could be really enjoyable for people to learn new things, you know, to get more job satisfaction, as that Australian analysis suggested. But it's not going to be easy, and it will be about employees and employers working together, and not just seeing the training line in the budget as a small thing you do occasionally, but recognizing that training and development will be a core business for any organization.
Yeah, I think even looking beyond that, organizations are beginning to recognize that they need to adapt to the new environment, and so they need personnel who can help them to adapt. So ideally, it's really in their interest to train their employees and help them help the organization to continue to thrive as well. Don't you think?
I absolutely agree with you. And I think the knock on of that for other aspects of organizational culture and infrastructure are also important, because we're going to have to rethink a lot of what happens in human resources and employment regulations, for example, because at the moment people tend to be employed on a job description, but that job description may need to change many times after that person's been employed. So we'll need to develop more flexible practices in order to enable the growth of the individual and therefore the growth of the business.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but this has been great. This is a great presentation, Rose. Thanks for taking the time to present this.
Thank you for your assistance, Lewis.
Yes. Actually, one more question before we go that just came in. So in what ways do you think having AI assistants, for example, doing continuous formative assessment will change teacher roles and the feedback that teachers give and the type of feedback that teachers give? Please speak to that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the things that the teacher role will involve more of is this mentoring. And I think that will require teachers to have much more sophisticated data literacy, because they will need to understand a bit about what the AI has done to the data, to analyze it, to make sure that they agree with the AI, because we don't want to end up in a situation where that our own human intelligence isn't part of the loop of that analysis. It's going to be about teachers working with the data, working with the analyzed data, working with the learner, trying to explain to the learner what it is that the data is telling us, and taking into account how that learner feels about their own progress, how that teacher feels about that progress. So I think it's going to be more of a mentoring, more of a data analysis, but then looking at the much greater detail of analysis about learner progress, and then using the teacher expertise to say, okay, I can see that this student has really persevered with this task, and yet they're falling over at this particular point in the program, and therefore it appears that they've got a fundamental misconception at point X. Now, how do I deal with that misconception? So the feedback might be about that misconception, but it might also be feedback that relates to that perseverance, that congratulates the students on the perseverance, but then builds the student back up again through explaining the misconception. So, before I went into academia, I taught in schools and I taught in further education colleges, and even teaching in university. You get that feeling with a student where you think, if only I understood more about what they didn't understand, I could really help them. And I think that's what this analysis can provide. So I think it gives the tools to the teacher to give more nuanced feedback and more precise feedback, both in terms of the explicit issue that the student is facing with, say, solving an equation, but also in terms of how they are performing as a learner, that persistence, that resilience, how they're performing emotionally. So I think it just gives us a much better toolkit to help mentor and support our learners.
Great. Okay, well, we'll have to stop here. Thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar in the series. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.